The Chinese news media refused to cover the Xinjiang story until the reporting produced by international news outlets grew too compelling to ignore. The aerial shots of specific camps, the documents proving their ultimate purpose. That material was first broadcast on radio and television networks outside of China. But much of it was handed to those journalists on a plate by a handful of independent researchers practicing open source journalism, relying on online tools ranging from search engines to satellite imagery. Those researchers have played a critical part in the reporting process, and Beijing is onto them. It's now doing a better job of covering its tracks online, burying the evidence of its operations in Xinjiang. The Listening Post's Daniel Turi now on two open-source investigators and the role they have played in helping foreign journalists and the rest of the world understand the reality of Xinjiang's camps.
In the most heavily surveilled province of one of the most surveilled countries on Earth, almost every movement is monitored, whether you're a local or a journalist on assignment.
The first thing you notice is the extreme level of police presence. On every intersection, on every block, there is often a multi-story police building. There are security checks everywhere. And if you add to that the fact that there are also surveillance cameras on every street corner, kitted out with facial recognition technology, then you very quickly get to feel the sense of being surveilled, of being watched wherever you are.
According to a report by the Foreign Correspondents Club of China, 9 in every 10 foreign journalists who traveled to Xinjiang last year spoke of interference from the authorities. Some were detained by police. Others forced to delete data on their phones and other devices. Almost all the reporters, 96%, say they were visibly followed. Then there are the far graver dangers that face local sources. Last year, journalist James Palmer, formerly based in China, spoke about his personal experience trying to cover Xinjiang.
All of my Uyghur sources are gone. Sorry. I can't talk to people because they're gone. I cannot reach them. When we look at the lists of reasons that have been given for people to be sent to concentration camps, having had contact with foreigners is the single most dominant reason. I have certainty of one of my sources being sent to a camp. With the others, I don't know whether they've just cut off contact for their own safety or whether they're actually imprisoned. I stopped trying to reach Uyghur sources in about the middle of last year because the risk to them was much greater than any possible benefit of talking to them.
For its part, China says there is no such thing as so-called re-education camps in Xinjiang. A growing body of evidence suggests otherwise.
Despite the straitjacket imposed on reporters inside Xinjiang, coverage of the camps has surged over the past year.
Researchers have now identified and mapped nearly 100 suspected re-education camps and detention facilities across Xinjiang.
Much of that recent reporting is the result of investigations done from a distance by researchers using a method known as open source. Open source is shorthand for the tools and data available to virtually anyone with an internet connection, a nose for forensic research, and in the case of this story, the ability to read Mandarin. Open source journalism is not limited by geography and respects no borders, which is why I've come here to Stuttgart in southwest Germany to speak to a researcher who's been investigating the camps almost 6,000 kilometers away in Xinjiang. So you're one of the first researchers to use open source methods to investigate these camps in Xinjiang. What made you think that you would succeed using these tools where conventional journalists had failed?
The big advantage of this open source research is that you can uncover documents that speak of systematic policy, where the government itself says, we're doing this, and every local government under us is also supposed to be doing this. And oftentimes I was able to find this kind of document.
What's this particular document?
So this is the main supposed legal foundation for re-education. So when the Chinese say we have established de-extremification centers based on the law. This is the document they refer to. Another document that I found talks about the goals of transformation through education. It even very blatantly says that transformation through education, in Chinese 教育转化, cleanses the brain from evil thoughts or from the thoughts of religion. That's a piece of evidence that speaks as much or more than 100 newspaper articles, because it basically proves that this is a systematic policy.
The documents that Zenz uncovered were evidence of state policy, but proving the camps had actually been built, enough of them to hold hundreds of thousands of people, required another open source tool, satellite imagery. That's where Sean Jiang, a Chinese student based in Vancouver, came into the picture.
I started my research last year when I heard reports that around 10% of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang had been detained or disappeared. I used a few keywords to search online and found lots of information, such as government tender notices for camps to be built. These documents contain the addresses of nearly 100 camps, so I searched on Google Earth and found the satellite images. They looked very different from civilian facilities. For example, there were barbed wire fences, there were watchtowers, structures that you'd expect in prisons. I found more and more information and so published it on my blog.
Satellite imagery and information collected by a researcher in Canada indicate that the camp has recently undergone major construction.
Documents found by Mr. Zenz mention psychological counselling for the children of parents taken to the camps.
A lot of mainstream media's coverage has built upon Adrian or Sean's work. You've seen Adrian's using government documents and hiring information to show the extent to which the security state has grown in Xinjiang. And Sean has used satellite imagery to show the camps being built almost in real time.
In the Financial Times, we've also used satellite imagery to look at the location and size of the camps. We've also used research by Adrian Zenz on the contracts that governments are using to buy new materials for the camps. And I think the really important thing about these kinds of research collaborations is that because the data is open, the journalist can also check what the researcher is looking at, and if needed, challenge whether the data they're seeing is representative of the region or how the data was chosen.
Communist Party officials, not usually known for their transparency, gave open source researchers a helping hand by leaving the evidence in plain sight. Now, Beijing is in damage limitation mode, trying to delete documents before investigators in Stuttgart, Vancouver and elsewhere archive and repost them. An online game of cat and mouse over one of the world's biggest stories.
I post my findings on my blog and I include the links to the original documents. But those links started showing up as invalid within a couple of weeks or even within a few days of me posting them. I could see the Chinese government was reading my blog and deleting the original sources.
The set of documents that disappeared basically describe the details of the camps, the security features, barbed wire, watchtowers, how big they are and what they cost. A lot of that disappeared. And so we were feverishly starting to archive websites and spent almost entire days on archiving hundreds of links. But I think in some sense, they pulled it too late. We already had the information.
By staying one step ahead of Beijing, open source researchers unearthed evidence about the camps that journalists on the ground in Xinjiang could not. But going up against a superpower, magnifying scrutiny of an already notorious human rights record, comes with consequences. All the more so in this case if you're a Chinese citizen.
Since I started my research, I have felt a lot of pressure from the Chinese government. For example, they have contacted my family in China. So in the near future, I think I will avoid going back home. Despite all this, I think doing this work is worth it, because there are so many Uyghur people detained. They've lost contact with their families. At least my research can raise awareness of this problem and help pressure the Chinese government into finding a peaceful solution.
Without the reporting that's taken place outside of the country, Chinese officials would have very little to answer for on the Xinjiang story. As we heard from Aleem Saitov of RFA Uighur, Beijing is now saying that the vast majority of the Uyghurs interned have since been freed, their thoughts transformed. However, no evidence has been offered to back up those numbers. So you can expect that journalists working out of Washington and researchers combing the net for the truth in Vancouver and Stuttgart will be fact-checking that claim, as they have so many others in the coverage of this story.